excited about this. So,
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanne, for inviting me.
yeah, we have our annual blessing of the sneakers mask coming up because the Detroit Free Press Marathon runs right in front of the building. So we do that. And then as we were talking more about the spirituality and stuff of sport, Father Gary was like, you should talk to Father Pat. So would you just, since I'm like, I don't know a whole lot, and obviously my listeners may not, just talk about your current role, like where are you now? What are you doing?
Yeah, well, I just recently arrived here in Omaha, Nebraska at Creighton University. So in the middle of August, I moved here from Detroit. And so I'm the holder of something called the Hyder Chair. It's an endowed chair for Jesuits. And so in that chair, I'll teach one course a semester, and I'll have a lot of time for writing and research. And then I also continue. I've been teaching every other year for one semester at the Gregorian University in Rome, and so I'll continue doing that while I'm here as well. But I was at University of Detroit Mercy, a place that is very close to my heart, for the last 4 years, teaching there and working some in mission and ministry. That I was at Seattle University for 13 years.
Wow, that's a long time. So you kind of got involved in this idea of sport. Now, was that when you were in Seattle or before that? Has this kind of been like your thing for all of your ministry?
Well, I think the truest way to describe that is it's been kind of a thing for me most of my life. So, you know, I we all enjoy different things. And when I was growing up, when I was a boy, I loved playing sports or even just like throwing the ball against the wall and catching it with my glove or, shooting baskets, things like that. So, yeah, so then I played sports and played on teams and at St. Valentine's grade school in Redford Township. And then
Oh, that's right by me.
oh, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I went to Bishop Borges High School and played football and basketball there and ran track a couple years. And then I played football at Grand Valley State University in the west side of the state of Michigan. And so anyway, when I was in my 20s, I had some important experiences spiritually in college at Grand Valley State and studying with the Jesuits at the University of Detroit. And that's where I first met the Jesuits, and that's where my vocation started. Um, but during my 20s, before I entered the society, there was a part of me that thought, well, I should put behind me all, like St. Paul says, put aside childish things when I wanted to be serious about living the spiritual Christian life. But I discovered over time that didn't work well for me. And I think it was because I'd been too profoundly shaped as a human being in my participation in sports in good ways and maybe some not so good ways. And so that kind of human formation was impacting my attempts to live the Christian life. I didn't have two lives. I had one life and God was present in all of it. Now, that became very clearest to me when I made the spiritual exercises retreat when I was a Jesuit novice. And Father Gary Wright was my novice director, so your pastor there. And so he knows this very intimately. I haven't given him permission to speak about everything publicly, but he knows my experience of just having a sense of, we start off the retreat, how is God present in your life? So I was reconnected to my youth and the sports. And then as the retreat unfolded, it seemed like there was an invitation to, kind of walk with others in this area too. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing as a Jesuit has been related to sports in one way or another. When I did my dissertation, I did my doctoral dissertation at Claremont Graduate University. And I can talk more about that if you like. But the question I had going in was, what would a Catholic approach to sports be, you know, as an aspect of culture? And there hadn't been much written about that, or you know, prior to that time. Certainly no book length treatments of that subject. So that was ended up being the subject of my first book, Catholic Perspectives on Sports from Medieval to Modern Times. And then a teaching I've been doing and other things, I've been writing more about sports in the contemporary context, you know, and how sports can lead to the growth of the person, you know, formation in value, open connection to others, self-transcendence, or on the other hand, how sometimes it can diminish persons, you know. And that's kind of things I look at in my classes and in my writing.
Yeah. So doing your graduate work, is that when you, I can never say his name.
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi?
Yes. Is that when you connected up with him?
Yes, in person, yeah. I had a Jesuit in Detroit introduced me to his book Flow, Mihai, the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he had been using it in his work with business people. And so I started using it in classes I was teaching in Detroit. And then when I did doctoral studies, he had already gone to Claremont Graduate University, and so I went there to work with him, which was wonderful. And he was wonderful to me. I did several independent studies with him, and he's good to all his students. You know, I visited his home in the mountains in Montana where he writes. You know, on a few occasions, and even after I had graduated. So, uh, yeah, his work is, I think, a great resource.
Will you talk a little bit about this idea of sport and flow and
Yeah,
joy?
yeah,
Because you have a
yeah,
chapter in your book about it.
yeah. So, so, you know, when I first read the book called Flow and other things that he wrote, I felt like I was reading for the first time somebody who was giving voice to, or words, putting words on things that I had experienced all my life playing sports, in terms of what does it feel like, you know,
Right.
and what makes it enjoyable. Why is it so captivating, you know? And so that was a real contribution that he made, you know. And he did this. So he was interested in, first he was doing his doctoral work. He was interested in the creative process. He had met painters in the Chicago area, and you know, they weren't going to become famous likely or make a lot of money through painting, yet they were completely immersed in what they were doing. They loved to talk about the subtleties of it. And so he was intrigued by this, and he said, what is this enjoyment that we get, people experience when they're engaged in complex activities? So he studied people in different kind of play activities, and including some who were involved in sports. And so out of that, he heard people talking about different kind of elements of their experience. So some of them are, you center your attention completely on what you're doing, you know. So and he calls it, in another place, he calls it a merging of action and awareness. And so what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about become one and the same. Yeah. The Buddhists would use the term mindfulness to describe this. And one of the things that disappears is yourself from your explicit consciousness. So because the activity requires all of my attention, I don't have any attention left over to also be explicitly thinking about myself, you know, like what do they think of me, or how are people going to, you know, respond if I miss this shot, something like that. All that goes away when a person's experiencing flow, and it happens when we're engaged in enjoyable activities that come to have their own, you know, intrinsic rewards. We find them intrinsically rewarding and enjoyable. So a couple other elements of it would be, the word flow kind of captures this, that it feels effortless, or like he says, as though you're being carried along by a current. But that's preceded by discipline. You know, you have to practice something over time, or maybe for a long time, and then eventually it starts to feel kind of this effortlessness, like you've been doing it your whole life. Some other things people mention is a sense of union with your surroundings. So if it's climbing a mountain, I might feel more connected, more aware of my connection to the created world, or if I'm playing in a band, I have a sense of attunement with the bass player if I'm the guitar player. And there's a sense of union with the group members of the group as we're playing the songs. And then in sports, of course, the most common experience people describe is the bond that develops among the teammates if it's a team sport. Uh, so in a way, in team sports, the egolessness, or selflessness, not thinking about myself all the time, and being part of something larger than myself, which is the team, go together. I'm not thinking about myself all the time because I'm part of this larger group, and we're pursuing these goals we have in common. And so you might already be picking up on the fact that a lot of these elements are similar to the way spiritual writers have described, the dynamics of the spiritual life. And Csikszentmihalyi himself acknowledged this even in his first articles. He acknowledged this connection with meditation, with religious rituals, any form of religious experience, he says. And for me as a Jesuit, what I was intrigued by were the analogies, similarities with spiritual consolation, what Ignatius calls spiritual consolation. For him too, it's a spiritual consolation experience is an experience of joy. Yeah. There's a kind of ease to it, or effort. It's like he says at one point, it's like a drop of water falling into a sponge, or coming into your own house through an open door. This feels like, God's presence in my life as I'm living in the Spirit. There's a kind of effortlessness to it, a kind of ease, but that's preceded by discipline for Ignatius too, making the spiritual exercises, so we have to contemplate the life of Christ and be faithful to our prayer, and be disciplined, but then over time it becomes a kind of ease, or a kind of sense of the Spirit, Holy Spirit in one's life, and a sense that one is going along with that. The image that Csikszentmihalyi uses is though you're being carried along by a current. We can kind of reflect on that theologically from a Christian perspective. Like the Spirit is carrying us along.
Your work, because you were doing a lot of teaching on that concept here in Detroit, but you're doing work overseas also. Like you've got a trip coming up for that too, right?
Yeah, I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll go to Detroit first, but I'm going to do a workshop for the Jesuit schools of the Euro-Mediterranean province, so all of Italy and Albania, Romania, and it's in Malta. And it's basically about, I think what they want to do is they want to have the sports that the kids participate in. And then they also have sports centers there in Italy that the Society of Jesus sponsors. So they want to have those more meaningfully connected to Jesuit, values, Jesuit education, and spirituality. So we'll be with a group of about 50 people who coach, or teach or lead the schools there.
And one of the things you were saying, which I wasn't aware of, is that the Jesuits were actually the first ones to introduce sports as education.
Yeah, well,
can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, the humanists of the Renaissance would have been the first, but then you may be aware that the Jesuits were profoundly influenced by the humanists in the Renaissance and their schools in terms of the way we approached education. There's a great book called Ignatian Humanism by a man named Ronald Modras that describes this impact. And so the humanists in the Renaissance were the first. Actually, they're the first who are educating primarily lay people, you know, um, society was changing, now there are different kinds of jobs, and the economy was shifting, and the printing press, it was being developed, and these kind of things. So so the humanists were the first to educate primarily lay people, but also they were the first then to include play and sport as a part of the education of the whole person, for all students. I mean, in the life at court, that it would be common for the knights to be trained, and maybe some of the sports and physical exercises would have more of a kind of military, fencing and things like that, jousting. And so, but then with the humanists and the Renaissance, they start the more ball games involved. There's more, and they see it to be connected to the formation of the whole person, which is going to help the person to make a contribution to society and to the common good. So that humanist approach to education, resonated well with a lot of the approaches of the early Jesuits, and so the Jesuits too um, were educating lay people, and they included time for sport and play in their schools as well.
Right.
And then the Jesuits might have been significant because they had so many schools, so then their significance might be greater than the humanists in the Renaissance, because they had almost 800 schools by the time they were suppressed in the late 18th century. So it's all throughout Europe and other parts of the world as well. And they all tended to be, there's that famous Ratio Studiorum published in 1599 that laid out the way of educating, And in that, you see there's an insistence on that there need to be a break, or a balance between study and recreation periods, and you see, the first schools the Jesuits built themselves have a courtyard in the middle where the kids
Wow.
would play. And then there was time after the noonday meal, time was allotted for play and recreation, things like that. There was every Thursday was a general recreation day, that kind of thing.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love that. I love knowing that history. And yeah, there is, in order to switch gears, right? You really need that break in between.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
And by the way, so both the humanists and the early Jesuits were influenced by Thomas Aquinas in this respect.
yeah.
Because he asked in his Summa Theologica, can there be a virtue about games? And he answers yes, because virtue has to do with moderation. So he's getting that from the ancients, it's an Aristotelian idea. And so a person shouldn't be working all the time or serious all the time. That would be excessive. And
Oh,
so a fully human life needs also time for recreation and play and what's enjoyable, And so it's a virtue that has to do with living a virtuous life. In fact, he says there can be sin in a lack of play, because you're being excessive. So anyway, so the humanists and early Jesuits, you see the explicit influence there, because they're saying we don't want to be excessive with the studies because it would become a burden to the students. They also need to have relaxation in recreation. So there's, direct influence there.
wow. I love that. And that, I mean, that's true, right? Look at, I mean, in America, right? I mean, we're applauded if we're an excessive worker.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah. So I think I call it a play ethic that comes from Thomas Aquinas. I think that this is one aspect of the longer cultural, we could call it heritage, or the theological heritage tradition, that's connected to Catholic schools, to Jesuit education, spirituality, that I think can make a meaningful contribution to the American context today.
Yes.
Because like you're saying, we're applauded for we're known for the work ethic in the United States,
Mhm.
right? But for example, one of the problems today, even with youth sport, is that the play element is going out a bit,
Right.
the enjoyment, doing something for its own sake. It has its own intrinsic meaning, you know. And so this play ethic that I'm talking about, because that's what Thomas Aquinas says in another place, plays, actually, he compares it to contemplation. He says play is like contemplation because they're both enjoyable and we do them for their own sake.
Right.
Yeah. So he's, it's kind of blows people's minds maybe because in our heritage and in the U.S. context, if you think of the Puritans, would be the people who are connected with the work ethic that the sociologist Max Weber wrote about. We tend to think of play as maybe connected to sin, or it's distracting us from
Yeah.
work, what's really important, what's godly. And so, but Aquinas sees it as connected to the highest thing we do in the spiritual life, which is contemplation, that it's like contemplation. So be virtuous play if it's not directed to an end, because for Aristotle, a virtuous activity had to be directed to an end.
Right.
And Thomas responds by saying, well, the enjoyment we experience in play is direct. It's not directed to an external thing like money or something like that, but it is directed to the good of the player.
Yes.
It gives them pleasure and recreation and, kind of fullness of life.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The experience is the end of
Yeah.
itself. It's, in
Yeah.
the end of itself.
And
okay. So since we're talking a little bit about ethics, I want to go, can we go back to what you were, when you were in Seattle, because you were there for 13 years and you were teaching, and I know you have a story about Scribble, right? And so will you talk a little bit about your work there in Seattle, and then maybe we can weave it into that story you have of him?
okay, great people at Seattle U. Beautiful also, by the way.
Yeah, right.
Out there.
Class that you were teaching that.
So I
he
taught
took.
a class called, which I'm going to teach next semester here. I taught in Detroit too.
Mhm.
I called it The Soul of Sport, an interdisciplinary inquiry. And so we read some philosophy and psychology and theology, spirituality. And it was divided up into two main parts after an introductory part. And we looked at how does sport participation contribute to the growth of the person, well-being, self-transcendence, maybe opens out onto spiritual values in the first half of the class.
Okay.
And we read different things, but it was kind of, the flow theory was basic to it. Then the
Right.
second part of the class, we looked at how does sport participation in the contemporary context lead to the diminishment of the person, no? And maybe desolation with respect to meaning in one's life. And what are the values in the wider society that maybe are present there that lead to that, or what's going on inside of the athlete, their own way of experiencing themselves and their bodies in sports competitions. I mean, one of the things that we look at there is the way, a kind of mechanistic way of experiencing one's body, so body as machine, can lead to problems, and but
Oh,
it's
yeah.
but that's a way of thinking about the human body that was pretty, has a lot of influences in the West.
Yeah. Coming from
Post,
the Industrial Revolution idea. Yeah.
yeah, well, and post Rene Descartes,
Oh,
there was actually a group of philosophers that were called mechanists, and so we had a tendency to think of the human body, an analogous way to the rest of the material world, which was understood as a machine, for in different periods. So anyway, I think that's sometimes still present in sports, even though philosophers have criticized that, and since then, and then it can lead to difficulties. From our point of view, from a Jesuit Ignatian point of view, one of the main difficulties is that it starts to cut a person off from their interior life and affectivity in particular, which would make intimacy not possible or more difficult as a person who's growing up into their 20s, but also in our context would make discernment more difficult, because
ooh, interesting.
I don't know what it is I'm experiencing actually, or so anyway, yeah, those are some of those things. So, um, yeah, and then you mentioned I have my Detroit Tigers shirt on today. And I know because the Tigers are playing later today, fifth game in Seattle, and Tarek Skubal is pitching. Everyone knows, I'm sure, who's listening to this. So, and I was, really happy. I taught Tarek when he was a freshman at Seattle U. So, I didn't know. So before I knew he was a really good baseball player, um, it stood out to me. And this isn't always the kind of thing that you remember as a professor because you have so many students. But
Right.
even if Tarek hadn't become, a professional baseball player, I remember taking note of the fact that he really grasps the material well. And I noticed that because I had just taken a class, in the previous couple of years that was taught to seniors and juniors. We changed the core curriculum. So now I was teaching it to freshmen and sophomores. And like I said, it was an interdisciplinary class. So I noticed that other freshmen struggled with philosophy, for example, or psychology. But I noticed right away that Tarek really grasped the material well, and he writes very well. So I'm assuming, I don't know his high school, but he probably had a very good high school education, and always just a very nice, you know, uh, nice person, young man. Self am impressed with him as a teammate. He's in addition to his pitching, which is phenomenal. Um, he's he's very mature, I feel like, the way he's handled everything, but then also the way he in one interview I remember people were talking about if he did this, he would get, this would affect his whatever, numbers in a certain way and he said, I don't really think about that much, what makes this most enjoyable is the team aspect of it and working with the other players to accomplish something. So he's very, I think he has good values and is grounded well. Uh, I don't know if you saw when he threw a pitch recently and a batter squared around to bunt the pitch and the ball hit him in the nose.
Oh, gosh.
And it was a serious thing, and he was injured quite seriously. And Tarek was visibly affected by it, And he went after the game. He saw the manager for the other team, and he joined the manager and went to the hospital to visit the player. So I thought that was just a wonderful, kind of testimony to his character. He keeps the humanity of the game present, and that's a good example of that. That
Right.
our opponents are not our enemies. We're, he as he said at the time, this wasn't just a baseball thing; it's a human thing.
Continue to keep that humanness in sport, especially professional sports, right?
Yeah,
Because it's so often about the money, the sponsor, all of
yeah.
that. And so keeping that element, and I think he even did say in one of his articles that he attributes a lot of it to the class he took with you.
The thing that Tarek has said that he appreciated was learning about the flow
Yeah,
theory. Yeah,
yeah.
and the students always write a paper about an experience of flow that they've had. So I'm
Yeah.
sure his was about pitching, even though I don't remember.
uh,
Who knows? Maybe it was.
yeah,
He
right.
played many sports, so yeah.
And I thought it's interesting because since you mentioned flow again, when you were talking about Ignatian practicing spiritual exercises and um, what one of the things that I've noticed, and I think this goes back to your idea of flow, is that the more often you practice them, the easier it is to get into that flow and to have that connection with God, because I'm guessing it's because we're building up those neural pathways or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think maybe prayer is like any activity, although it's also different in some respects. But
Yes.
but when we're learning anything for the first time, we have to consciously be thinking about how to do it. And if it's a sport, we have to listen to the coach and she tells you what foot to jump off of and how your elbow should be situated. And then you have to practice it and try to remember what they said. And it takes a lot of mental energy and attention and practice. But then over time, a lot of that just kind of falls away, and it becomes there's a kind of ease to it, and yeah. So, and I think in both cases too, there's a kind of I mentioned that in flow, there's a centering of your attention on a limited stimulus field, and so your distractions are, you know, we're not being distracted by external things or thing. That's kind of there's the same thing that happens with prayer, every morning, or whenever it is we pray. We have to quiet our mind down and not be distracted by even by good thoughts, or we have to, okay, no, I'm just going to be present here, in the presence of God. I do wonder if maybe, formation in sports for young people, that's one of the things that happens at the human level,
Right.
that they learn how to do that, like I learned how to quiet my mind down so I have a human experience of doing that. And I can now also do it as I want to place myself, in the presence of God. I'm in the presence of God already, but I want to become aware of that. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier that it takes away that sense of self, right? Which, I mean, to connect with God is ultimately we have to detach that from our sense of self a little bit.
Yeah. Although it's paradoxical, a certain part of ourself maybe, or a certain way of kind of thinking is being quieted down. That what's unleashed or what's experienced in flow is our true self, our or in prayer when we're have that sense of spiritual consolation, feel as though we're being carried along by a current, that that one way to think about that might be that that's my true self. And then the way Thomas Merton talks about the true self, that it's basically that it's another way language to use for the image and likeness of God, created in the image and likeness of God. And what sin does is it defaces that, or this is kind of what maybe the way Paul describes redemption is that we're living back into who we are, created to be by God.
Yeah.
And Ignatius actually, so his spirituality, he has a kind of confidence that we can get there, that it is possible to live there. And
Okay.
and that's why, you know, yeah. So I think all of his teaching and the emphasis on spiritual consolation, which historians of the Jesuits have said is central to who the Jesuits are.
Right.
And John O'Malley says they were about ministries of consolation. That's the way they understood themselves, what they understood themselves to be doing. All of that presumes that, oh yes, it is possible to be in right relationship with God, to be, trying to live out of that. That doesn't mean that we're not sinful. Well, everyone is, a sinner, but it is possible to. We're not just a lump of sin, that's not like the truest thing about us, I guess,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Right. How about the Jubilee of Sport? Because I had never heard of it. So maybe there's other people that don't even know what that is. And then
the Jubilee of Sport is just during this Jubilee year, they have a lot of different, like in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a Jubilee for the Synod participants, people who participated in the Synod. There was one for migrants, I think, recently, and so they have different groups that are gathering as part of the Jubilee year. And one of the groups was people involved in sports. And so the Dicastery for Culture and Education has an office that deals with sports. And so anyway, this kind of thing explicitly in terms of the dicasteries, which are basically offices,
Mhm.
engagement with sport has been going on since I started really John Paul II's term, maybe, and so there was an office of the church in sport in the 1990s, even was doing work in this area, and that was in the Pontifical Council for the Laity at the time. And then the Dicastery for Culture started doing it too in more recent years, and now they're the dicastery that does these kind of things. So they put on the Jubilee of Sport that happened in June. And they had a audience on a Saturday with Pope Leo in St. Peter's Basilica. So it was so it was full. It wasn't just the people connected with sports that were there. And then on the following day was a Sunday. It was Trinity Sunday, and Pope Leo gave his whole homily about sports
Oh, wow.
on Trinity Sunday. And he said, well, we might seem a little bit unusual to be thinking about sports on Sunday. We celebrate Trinity. And then I heard some priests sitting in front of me laughing, kind of, that's kind of strange. But then he did a beautiful homily. And one of the things he was saying, one of the points he was making was that when we experience that kind of bond that I was referring to earlier on a team, and we each sharing the gifts that we have in connection with the teammates, and we become close to one another, that it can be a kind of symbol or kind of maybe even an experience of what the Trinity is, which is a communion of persons, the distinct person yet in union, and we're called to live that way in society, that is so there was a book length thing called "Giving the Best of Yourself" that the Vatican. This was actually the dicastery for laity, family, and life. They published in 2018. It came out. It was the first ever book length treatment of sport published by the church. Wow. That was during Francis's papacy, and I was part of that, so I helped to revise that document. It was originally put together when Benedict was Pope, and then we were now going to be publishing it when Francis was Pope, and so they wanted some of us to work on it and incorporate some of Francis's, thinking and into the document. Maybe if I could just say a couple things. I think there are some themes in what the popes have said about sports, and they've said quite a bit, starting in the 20th century and then into this century. So some other themes are the dignity of the human person is fundamental. And so John Paul II says the person doesn't exist to serve sport, but rather sport should serve the human person.
Right.
In their integral development, he calls it, or their development as a whole person in freedom. That's the proper way to, and that's a basic kind of application of Catholic social teaching. He says the same thing about the economy, and so so that's actually foundational for the work I do. I mentioned the class that I teach, and so if that's the principle, sport should serve the human person, then it's important to, read psychology and other studies that'll help us to understand how does sport serve the human person, or how does it maybe diminish the person, So we have to have like data. We have to have some kind of way of access into the experience of participants in sport to be able to meaningfully engage with that. And then the second thing that I think is distinctive about what the popes have taught has to do with the connection of sport to the common good. So, building up of community, but also to the unity of the human family. So the popes, every Olympics, they'll come out with a statement before the Olympic Games, and they talk typically, and Francis would use words like the culture of encounter. Sports can help us to build a culture of encounter.
Oh, yeah.
Because it crosses culture, nations, religions, races, and it helps us to gives us an opportunity to remember our shared humanity.
As we kind of get ready to close, I guess a couple of thoughts. One is, maybe do you have some words of advice for um, living in this chaotic world and how, I mean, some of it we've kind of shared, but if anything specific you might want to share about um, how sports and play might help us in this specifically chaotic time.
Yeah. Well, I that it to hold on to our humanity. No,
Yeah.
um, we mentioned Tarek earlier, Tarek Skubal. I mean, one of the things I like about when you watch him pitch, I don't know if you've ever seen him, but the guys that he can't get out, he's always after they get a hit off him and they're standing on second base, he's kind of turning around, he's kind of laughing, say, "What am I supposed to do with you?" Or when they're coming off the field. So it's kind of like it's still like play,
Right.
He's enjoying himself. It's not, and but it's the humanity that's still there. I feel I appreciate when he does that. So
Yeah.
I do, and I think that that's actually the appeal of sport is it's so human. Um, and I myself would put it in the category of play or game in the sense that, it's not necessary thing. It's not we mentioned earlier, it's fun, do it for its own sake, or we,
Yeah.
we make up the rules, we make up the games and
Yeah.
introduce challenges, obstacles for ourselves, to make something more difficult than it would be otherwise. Whereas in the rest of life, you just try to you don't, you just take the easiest path from A to B, most
Right.
efficient way of doing something. But here you
Yeah.
you can't do that in sports. It's ruled out by the rules. So, but it's kind of gratuity to it all. It's so uh and part of it is also it has its own intrinsic rewards or meaning, or philosophers call it internal goods. They're
Got it.
goods that are internal to the experience itself or activity. Now, unfortunately, like many other areas of life, in the last few decades, sport has become increasingly valued in relation to external goods.
Mhm.
So it might be a college scholarship. It's a means to that end, or to money or to fame. And I think our lack of reflection on the human significance of sport makes it more vulnerable to being instrumentalized like that, only seen as value if it gets me a scholarship or something like that kind of thinking. Um, and then what happens, I mentioned the play ethic earlier, can be helpful. If a parent or a child or a coach is thinking about sports mainly, primarily as a means to an end of college scholarship, then they want their child to specialize in one sport early, thinking that it'll give them a leg up on the other kids.
Yeah. Right.
And 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 then and then we've been trying that for a couple of decades now. That, but there are a lot of issues with it because the kids' bodies aren't mature enough to train year round in one sport, and so overuse injuries, they weren't something that were much of a even known about in my time, but now they become so common because of that.
Wow.
But also kids burn out. They lose the
Yes.
joy of it. And then other kids who aren't so much interested in playing so seriously, they drop out too because they say the top reason is it's not fun anymore.
True. Yes.
That is to say, they view it mainly as a means to an end. So all the reorganization of conferences in intercollegiate athletics
Mhm.
happened driven primarily by money schools were going to get through television contracts for football,
Right.
you know, and then, but what was left out was the human beings, the young people that play. Some of them play their sports in the middle of the week, you know, and then so the women volleyball players or softball players, for example, from the West Coast started complaining about, how are we going to travel to the East Coast in the middle of the semester, you know, miss a week of classes or more. And so what I'm trying to illustrate there is sometimes when things are driven primarily by money or external goods, we can lose the human, it kind of corrupts the human experience of the practice in this case sports. When things are focuses on external goods, those usually come to individual persons or institutions.
Right.
So then parents or others, coaches or uh, they start to look at things more from the point of view of the individual,
Right.
what's good for their career, and less from the point of view of the team, the group that I'm playing with, and what's the experience like for the team, and how's the team doing. And you can see that it enters into youth sports, it enters into intercollegiate athletics. So, the massive amounts of money has been present at the highest level of college sports
Right.
for some time. Something needed to be done about that. So and the student athletes were the ones who were the main draw. So,
Yeah.
and the fact that so I understand that it's a justice issue, we could say. Um, so the question was like, who has access to these external goods or money? So that is a good question.
Right.
But they're not the only question to ask. Like you can also ask a question about the thing itself, or about sport itself. What's happening with sports? And I think it's pretty obvious. The combination of name, image, and likeness, the capacity for student athletes to receive money for that. And then the changes in the transfer portal, so kids don't have to sit out if they transfer from one school to another.
Right.
So it's just made intercollegiate athletics, football, especially basketball to some extent, just like kids are moving from one team to the next on a regular basis. But what's happening there is that the team or community dimension, being part of something larger than ourselves, is being lessened while the individual's pursuit of their own,
Oh, yeah.
benefit is being increased. And I think that actually one of the values of sports in American society, which is tended toward an individualistic, maybe we're criticized for that in much of the rest of the world. One of the values of sport in our society has been that it is an introduction for many young people to being part of something larger than themselves, playing on a team.
Right.
And learning with good coaching, you can learn how to use your talents and gifts and work together with other kids or a common goal. And so, anyway, I think now we're struggling as a society and in our world with how to live together, you know,
Yeah.
how people with different talents or come from different cultures, how do they contribute to the common good? That's like a core
Right.
challenge and
Mhm.
issue. And to the extent that young people were learning how to do that, how to be friends with kids from different backgrounds, or how to see themselves as having something to contribute, but working together with others. To the extent they were doing that in sport, I'm concerned that I hope we don't lose that as a resource in
Right.
terms of human formation, for how to live together. Um, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi refers to this, by the way, as differentiation and integration. And he's influenced by Teilhard de Chardin in this regard. And that has to do with differentiation is my own unique, talents, personality, interests, and those, blossoming or being used, but in such a way that I do it in harmony with other people and their talents and gifts. And when that's happening and we're doing it together in pursuit of a shared goal, he says that's how teams or societies grow or evolve, or institutions. When
Right.
both of those things are happening at the same time, the differentiation and the integration. I would say for parents and in terms of young people, when it comes to sports, do they enjoy do they enjoy the sport? And and are they learning from a good coach, like you know something about the intrinsic meaning, the values of the sport? Does
Right.
it have its own significance that they're learning about that? And enjoyment doesn't mean uh, um, it's always easy, or having a good experience of being part of the team. They're learning something about how to be part of something larger than themselves, that can serve them in the long term, in very significant ways, including in the life of faith. You know, St. Paul uses this imagery about we're different members, but the same body. You know, we each have
Right.
different gifts, but it's the same spirit. Um, so this being myself, but being part of the body, it's also present in our spirituality. Pentecost is about that as well, no?
Right.
Each group, each culture hearing the word in their own language. They can be themselves, but they're part of the body.
Right.